morning, everybody, and a huge welcome to Claudia and Idriss. I'll do a little brief introduction to Claudia and Idriss for you. Claudia is a leader in the inclusion and anti-racism space. She has a large breadth of experience in not-for-profit as well as the commercial sector, both here in Ireland and internationally. Claudia has worked with governments. She has developed policy and litigation based on inclusion and tackling racism in society. The technology sector is a natural place for Claudia's skills and expertise to drive and deliver on trust and safety, tackling bias to increase fairness and bring more humanity to AI. During her time in TikTok, Claudia established the DE&I in EMEA, the DE&I Council for EMEA. She is also the chair of Black and Irish and the chair of the Irish Network Against Racism. Round of applause for Claudia. Idriss started in consultancy in Paris. He ran his own sports social media platform business ahead of moving into some of the biggest names in social media in the world. He moved to Ireland to work in Twitter and is now business director in Meta. He is also on the Meta Ireland Executive Business Committee, and he is the first Black director in EMEA in Meta Ireland. Idriss is passionate about DE&I. He is the EMEA DE&I sponsor for Meta, and he has also a proven track record actively working to promote DE&I, formerly being involved in numerous support networks for disability and Black resource groups. Both Claudia and Idriss live in Ireland, and they are raising young families here, so they have a very important lens to share with us on inclusivity in Ireland. So moving on to our topic, which is bias in AI. Maybe we'll just level set about what bias is and why we need to talk about it. Bias is a tendency, an inclination, or prejudice towards or against an individual or a group of people based on specific characteristics that can include things like skin color, gender, beliefs. It is generally a set of characteristics that are diverse and that are immutable, that cannot be changed. And lest you think there isn't a lot of bias out there, humans have about 175 cognitive biases. Biases lead to distorted thinking. They influence our beliefs, and they can sway our decision-making. You may create false perceptions about people. You may make assumptions about people that are not based on facts. One of the ways bias surfaces in our everyday lives is stereotyping. Stereotypes have a major impact, and they lead to prejudice, and they lead to discriminatory practices and policies. So turning to my panelists, Claudia, maybe if I can ask you, what does bias mean to you? How has it impacted you, and how do you deal with it?
I think bias for me feels like where othering begins. It often feels like that gray area in between intention and impact. Also that gray area in between hypervisibility and invisibility. As a mixed race woman of Irish and Kenyan ethnicity, I have always known bias. It's at times part of my daily lived experience. I've experienced bias based on my appearance, my skin color, my surname, my ethnic ambiguity, all of it. It often feels as well, the impact of that bias often feels like that pressure that everybody who looks like you is being judged by your actions. So I have an off day, I make a mistake, there's someone there who might have that perception that they are like that. It often feels quite heavy, bias feels, the heaviness comes from this burden to educate the minority being left to educate the majority, being left to the minority. And that can be quite heavy. I think an example, I have many examples. try looking for a house to rent with a funny sounding surname. I have many examples, but in the professional space, I think one example I could make is monolingual bias. The perception that people have of people who are diverse or have any kind of visible minority who are multilingual is very different to the perception people have of our white counterparts who are multilingual. If you're white and multilingual, the perception is you're well-educated, maybe well-traveled, cultured even. But being a minority who's multilingual, the bias is doubt. Are you going to be able to effectively, eloquently produce something to the standard that is required? Is your English good enough? You know? What I do about it, I take up space authentically, you know? So this is me and this is who you're going to get. You're going to get this person who, just because I am mixed, is not half of anything. I'm this fully Irish, fully African, woman in tech, mom, person who can communicate hard things well. And I will challenge your biases just by taking up the space. And the second thing I do to challenge the bias is connection. I look for points of connection. That is that can be, as I referred earlier to that burden, that can sometimes be heavy, because the onus is always on me to look for the connection. Yeah. Look for the connection, find the ways to make sure people are seeing me. You know, not just seeing me because I'm the one who can talk about the experiences of me and my community, but seeing this other complex me that has all of these other hobbies and interests. The onus is on me. So yeah, while I do that, it is what it is. It's a daily lived experience.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. So you talked about that heaviness of feeling the burden of how you behave has a halo effect across all Black women. That's a heavy burden, and how we need to educate ourselves to understand that experience better. Idriss, tell us a little bit about your perceptions of bias and how it's impacted you.
Yeah, sure. And first thing, thanks, Claudia, for sharing so candidly personal things like this. And a lot of the things, actually, that you talked about resonate with me a lot. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of a background of who I am. So DI, as you said, is very core to who I am. It's always been part of my life. My journey started even before I was born. So I was born in France. My dad is from a small country in West Africa called Benin. He's Black, Muslim. My mom is from Spain. She's from Barcelona, white, Catholic. So I grew up in this household with 3 different cultures, 3 different languages, 3 different ways of life, pretty much. And that shaped me into who I am. Grew up in a deprived area in a small city in West France. DI is still part of my life every day, by the way. I'm married to a German wife. We have 2 Irish kids. So it's not just a passion. It's really part of my life and of who I am. And that's why everything that you said really resonates with me. But maybe one thing, if I have to, for sake of time and to be as impactful as I can, one thing and one theme that has been core to who I am and throughout my life is being the only one, or being one of very few. As far as I can remember, in school, was the only brown-skinned kid. High school, maybe 5 of us out of 500 students went to a business school, so bigger numbers, 3,000 students, still 5 of us. And unfortunately, that translated quite well as well into the workplace. So when I started working in consulting, big skyscraper, it's tough to say, in Paris, 5,000 employees in there, and again, we're maybe 10 people with a darker skin color. So it's always been like definitely a theme. And I think it's hard in the professional setup, I'm going to stick to that, but in the professional setup, sometimes to be the only one in the room, or one of very few, because it puts a lot of pressure on you. It can be daunting as well at times. You ask yourself a lot of questions. Am I supposed to be here? Do people around me want me to be here? You know, we always talk about imposter syndrome, so you have to be at peace with living with imposter syndrome. And the higher you get in terms of seniority, the more lonely you are, generally speaking, unfortunately. So when I think about biases in the workplace, maybe there's 2 things that I can share with the audience. The first one would be around what we call affinity bias. So a lot of studies show and proves that people tend to be more empathetic and more gravitating more towards people who look like them, who went to the same school than them, who are from the same city, the same social economic background. So if you're not part of this group, sometimes it's hard to build connection. And again, the more senior you get, when you get to the position at director level, VP level, etc., you need to build these connections. And sometimes it can be a challenge for people who are part of the minority. And the second thing I can share is around performance bias. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room can probably relate to that as well. But let's say that people tend, and again, there are loads of studies, I invite you to read Harvard business studies, etc. People tend to give more recognition to people who look like them, and that goes a little bit in pair with the affinity bias, and the empathy you show towards people who look like you. So usually when someone that is part of the majority achieves something, this person is recognized for it and gets full credit for it, and usually it's down to their own talents. When it's someone from an underrepresented community and not really represented in the room, usually the recognition is not the same. Sometimes it's even another person that is recognized for the work that you do. Sometimes you say something that can be very interesting, but nobody reacts to it, and then you have a colleague of yours who is part of the majority, who would get like a big clap from the entire room, as in, oh, that was a great idea. I said it actually a minute ago, and nobody really heard it, but it happened. So yeah, it's just about sometimes, making sure that people are aware of it, and people part of the majority are extremely intentional into maybe not letting these biases affecting people from underrepresented minorities and communities. And how do I deal with it? And we were talking about that a little bit earlier before we came on stage with Mary, but for me, and it might sound a little bit, I don't know, cheesy or whatever, but I would say focusing on what I can control. And for me, it's really something that has worked, but from a very, very, very young age. And it's not something that I've had to work on, but from a very young age, I told myself, let's not waste energy in comparing yourself with other people around you, because the world might not be fair, but that's how it is. The only thing that I can control, I cannot control the person across the desk, if they have bias or if they stereotyping me because of the way I look, because of my name, because of where I come from, whatever it is. I cannot control that. I don't even know it, by the way, when I look at the person, so that's out of my control. I cannot control if the world is fair or not fair, if my company is fair, not fair. What I can control is my input, so the work I put in, and the output, the results that I'm driving, the impact that I'm driving. So it's really the thing for me that has worked throughout the years and took me where I am today, is really making sure that I'm not competing against anyone in the room, I'm not comparing myself with anyone in the room, I'm just on my own journey. I control it, I control what I do, and I control where I want to go, and yeah, that's it for me.
Great words of wisdom. Thank you, Idriss. And I expect in this audience, so many people can identify and your experiences resonate with them, so thank you for sharing those with us. And for those where maybe it hasn't landed with you as much, you maybe have not experienced someone taking credit for your work or feeling like the only person, this is a good opportunity to think about that, what that might feel like. And did you make judgments about us before we spoke and you learned anything about us? Okay, so let's talk about AI. AI is everywhere. It's the new hotness, as my boss would say. And, it is an exciting, innovative technology. It's like the new internet, the new electricity. But AI is not new. It's been around for a very long time. The difference really is now that LLMs are widely accessible and people are using them from their smartphones. Machine learning and the algorithms are serving us content every day of the week. They're influencing our decisions, and they are giving us choices, and we are living our lives through these algorithms. And if we think about the models that are trained and developed and the data that is used for these models deriving the algorithms, if that data if it's incomplete, if it's not diverse enough, if it's flawed, there will be coded biases in those algorithms. And those coded biases translate to potentially harmful biases being proliferated. Some of the work that's been done by Joy Bolamwiri shows us where that shows up in specifically things like facial recognition technology and how there have been some really detrimental real-world impact in facial recognition technology being biased, such as wrongful convictions and incarceration in the United States. And there has also been contextual bias in policing in the UK. The UK government reported in 2020 that as a black person, you were 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched because of racial profiling. So it does have serious world consequences, but in saying that, there is great force for good. So maybe, Idriss, if I can ask you for your thoughts on the areas of concern in AI.
Yeah, sure. And maybe before I get to the areas of concern, just want to say that I deeply think that AI is a good thing as such. And AI is a transformative technology for our society, and that's how it should be seen by everyone. And it should also work well for everyone, that's for sure. But when you think about AI, for sure it's going to change our society, and it's normal to have some fears around the technology that is disrupting the way we are working, the way we are operating as human beings. But let's not look at it as a negative thing. And it was the same concern potentially throughout the years when television, for example, came up in humanity, computers, mobile phone, internet. So it's normal to have these fears. But let's embrace them, and let's make sure that this healthy fear helps us build responsibly. And when we talk about diversity in AI, what we often means is fair representation safely. And I think it's really key to talk about that, and that's why we need to build AI responsibly. Now, going back to your question around the areas of concern, there's definitely a few. Maybe the biggest one, and the one I want to share here with our audience, is around the fact that if not done properly, and if not trained properly, biases in AI, can worsen actually the social inequalities, can worsen the systemic racism, the social injustice, the discrimination. And I have a good example to bring that to life, by the way, for our audience. I don't know if people in the room remember, but 4, 5, 6 years ago, a big tech companies, I'm not going to name and shame, and that's part of the journey of developing AI, by the way, but a big tech company worked on a recruiting tool that was AI-powered. And the role of this recruiting tool was to vet resumes from candidates based on the database of the last 10 years within the company. So what were the resumes submitted, which were the employees that had done well in the company. Unfortunately, the tech industry, even more so 5, 6 years ago, is heavily represented and indexed on male representation. So what happened actually is that the tool was biased against a woman massively, so they downgraded pretty much every resume that came into their systems that had any label of woman within the text, that had a female name, that were mentioning some female-only colleges, for example. And at the end of the day, it was absolutely counterproductive, because just training on a database that was probably not the right one to train on, because it was already biased. It had like the perverse effect of actually removing all women from any processes. So after a few months, they realized that actually we do have some resumes, but there's no one in the loops. What's happening? And that's when they realized actually what went wrong with the AI tool. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there have been like a lot of time since this episode 5, 6 years ago, and now they do things differently. But that's a good example of the risk of bias if you don't want it to worsen actually the inequalities that already exist. And for me, that's probably the biggest one. Yeah. There's loads more, but that's the one I wanted to share.
And for you, Claudia, what concerns you?
I think my main concern, I'll bring it back to human bias. I think you've touched on that a little bit, Idriss. I think, AI is a transformative tool, but how are we training it? There's human behind AI. What are we feeding it? And I think that's a huge concern. And we've seen how that's played out. We've seen, for example, with how election periods are treated on social media. What is over-moderated and what is allowed is down to the humans that are training the machine. We've seen it play out with how languages are viewed on social media. So there are certain languages that are immediately, people's human bias impacts how those languages are treated. Languages like Arabic, Farsi, Swahili, languages from sub-Saharan Africa, they're not given the same kind of opportunities on these platforms, and that is down to the humans behind them training the machine. We've seen, we've also seen where it's worked, and where when we challenge those biases, it works really well. I might touch on that a bit later on, but overall, I think that's a huge part. I'm going to keep bringing the conversation back to humans, the AI conversation back to humans, because I think it's a core part of how we enjoy it.
And speaking of the humans, so we have a room full of professionals and technologists. And when I've been speaking to you both, the consistent message is fairness and humanity in AI. So I'm keen for this audience to take away some real-world learnings and from examples that they can then employ themselves as part of their engineering, development, policy, whatever you do for a living, you can influence and have a positive impact, even if it's questioning what you're seeing in your results. Is it really factual? So how can our wonderful audience increase fairness and reduce bias?
Yeah, that's a big question, but I can start with that, and I'll try to sum it up in 4 buckets. The first one is around the approach to developing AI models. I think open source is definitely the way we should go. Because by making AI models open source, we can tap into so many different networks, so many different communities, so many different areas of expertise. We can make sure that the entire community pretty much collaborates and work on it together, and make sure that they will be the ones calling for toxicity, for biases, for vulnerabilities, and I'll touch base on this on the second point. But it's really about the ideology of rather than letting one company doing the development and then having to trust this company doing it, having an open source model, for me, is probably the best approach. The second bucket that I would talk about is developing product with DEI and fairness in mind from the get-going. And here there's 3 pieces. The first one is around data curation. So making sure that regardless of the type of model you're working on, making sure that you have diverse data sets that represent a wide variety of people, as wide as possible, diversity, representation, making sure that we can collect data from different sources as well. We can remove outliers, for example, or anomalies from the data sets, everything that helps actually the algorithm work properly. Because, and that's for me the key message here, by the way, of our chat, the problem is not AI. The problem is more how we train AI, and potentially the data piece that we use to train the algorithm. Then, when you think about that data curation, and you think about the example I gave you earlier about this tech company and their recruiting tool, one thing that can be done as well is feature blinding, for example. This company could have avoided this, for example, if they would have made sure that in the data set they would have removed gender. They would have removed name, for example. Can work as well for a lot of different things, area, where you're from, etc. So that's definitely something to look into. And the last point into this piece of developing products with DEI in mind would be around testing. And I'm an absolute believer that when you work on AI-powered tools and algorithms, etc., you need to test it as much as possible, both internally and externally, making sure that it's put out there in front of developers. I remember, for example, at Meta, we submitted a Llama 2 at the DEF CON, so it was pretty much, we had 3,000 crazy developers testing it like everything a day to the full limit, And that's what helped us as well, develop it in the best way possible and in the fairest way possible. So I think this is extremely important to make sure that at every single stage of the development of the product that you test it. The third bucket that I'll talk about is around collaboration, and that goes, by the way, together with the open source. But I think it's important to have an industry collaboration and to make sure that we're all working together, so private companies, potentially states, nations. You can also have some developers, scientists, academic institutions, everything, but all come together to work on making it diverse and inclusive and fair. And the last piece for me is around the company structure. Make sure that you have the right company structure as well, actually, to provide equity in the way you develop your tools. Typically, do you have an ethic committee? I can talk about our example at Meta. We have, for example, inclusive product council. We have a responsible AI team. We have an equity product team working together in developing our AI-powered tools. At every single stage, they're working together to make sure the products are developed to serve all communities, to make sure we have the policies in place so that it's inclusive as much as possible, and to make sure that we implement and we execute the right way as well. So that would be my 4 points. Yeah.
So I hope everybody's taking notes, right? Lots of really practical, implementable things there where you talk about, even red teaming, questioning, making sure you've got diverse people working on these things. Claudia, I'm going to talk to you. I know policy and governance, and we know there's regulation coming in, and that's great, but regulation can only go so far. And what struck me when we were talking was, again, your passion around people and how we translate the solutions or what is needed from a policy and regulatory point of view into the technology. Tell us your thoughts on what we can do.
Yeah, so I think we really are sleeping on how effective, when we work collaboratively, AI can actually become. And we have good examples of that. We've seen examples of initiatives where trust and safety teams and policy teams have worked really closely with engineering teams and addressed issues like how human rights defenders are protected on social media. Human rights defenders are now on most of the major platforms are now enjoying a level of protection that was never there before. And this is because policy writers started working in, I suppose, maybe a less siloed approach and started working more collaboratively with engineers. I think we need to see more of that. I think, as you mentioned, I've worked in government, I've worked in the NGO sector. Never have I seen the amount of fearlessness and energy that goes into interrogating and questioning how effective and how efficient is this product going to be than I have in tech. And so I think that same energy that we have, that we put behind how we're developing products, let's put that behind bias. Let's put that behind AI. Ask the questions, because you can. A lot of the great leaders I've met in tech know that they're not the smartest people in the room, but they're coordinating some really brilliant people. So as part of that group, question, interrogate, hold people accountable, take ownership for something, don't allow it to slip. And I'll finish with that last point I made at the very start. The burden of educating the minority cannot always be left with the minority. So in whatever position you are in, you can challenge and you can make AI something a lot more effective for society.
Super, thank you, Claudia. Any final points for you, Idriss? Are we going to take some questions? I was going to say, ready for some questions. Yes, go for it, Tracy. Sure.
Would anybody like to ask some questions of our panel? Put your hand up.
Where's the fearlessness now, huh?
On the left, over there.
On the left.
Hi, thank you very much. So my name's Ethan. I'm from an organisation called Toast. I work in learning and development and have been actually my entire career. I was actually part of Idriss's onboarding class in Facebook, so I used to run the operations of NHO.
Okay, so let's connect after.
Nice to see you again.
Good
but on that same vein of L&D, I'd love to hear about maybe some of your thoughts about how L&D can maybe impact education, or I suppose access to education.
Either of you want to field that one?
I'm not
L&D.
100% sure.
So I suppose the impacts of AI in education.
Okay. Yeah. Well, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that's actually the first port of call, because I think being able to challenge bias comes down to informing, educating, and then using that, that education and information to actually make connections. And that's usually the first way it happens, because that's also the tool where you can put people's biases in front of them. And we all have biases, and I know how powerful it has been when I have had to face my own bias. And I think in the corporate setting, in the tech setting particularly, L&D is a fantastic place to do that. It's the most effective place to do that. Think about onboarding. Think about if people had bias training as part of onboarding. People do have that, by the way. I know it exists, but just think about how effective that is. We are setting the tone. You're onboarding, this is what we expect. This is what we want you to think about. People are leaving that process, really thinking about what it means to work in this space, to work in this company. And L&D is it's such a natural place for that work to happen.
And I think I'll add to that, Claudia. Great question. Thank you very much. Our office spaces where we work are microcosms of society, right? So what we learn and how we behave, that will translate across all of society. And I think to this point of education and learning and development, it leads into allyship, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. So once you, as you say, you face your biases, I'll call out one of mine. I remember someone asked me for a recommendation for, at the time I was a project manager. First thing I thought, someone just like me. Oh, wow, I need to think bigger and broader. And I can't unsee that now. And it has changed my behavior, it has changed my thinking. And that is incumbent on all of us, that learning and development, to see it, to stand up, to say something. Allyship is action. It's not about being kind or nice, it's standing up when you see something is wrong. Any other questions? Thank you.
And I think we've time for one more. There's a gentleman here on our right.
That's Ronan.
Is it on? Ronan Harbison, I'm the Executive Director of Generation Ireland. We are a charity that is, it's supported by JP Morgan, which is fantastic. We're a global charity that supports unemployed and underemployed people into employment. One of the things that we absolutely see is the bias for our underrepresented people that we serve when they're going into interview. And they come, they're massively diverse in terms of the group that we have, ethnically, culturally, color, you name it. And one of the things that we face is that we may have great support from, the leaders of organizations, but when it then comes to those hiring managers, there is bias there. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, what advice do you have to the organization themselves, to the leadership, of how can we educate those hiring managers to say, hey, let's look at something that is more non-traditional. Don't fear the non-traditional, because what we actually want is to have a workforce that is, more in line to the new Ireland. John Shaw spoke earlier on about we are the new Irish, right? That is what we need to reflect. Just if you have any advice to actually the leaders in organizations, be it tech companies, financial organizations, or whatever the case may be. Because what we are seeing is that the bias is, if you will, at the, in the middle ground. Mm-hmm. And that is not to take away from that, but it's just, it is about education. Yeah. And you guys have been inspirational, may I say, at the top of our stage, all three of you. So it'll be great to get some takeaways on that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ronan.
Thank you.
Anybody want to fill it? Yeah.
That's a great question. Not an easy one, to be honest. But I agree with you, by the way, and I'm probably personally, one person that you could have supported from a diverse background, probably different social economic background as well. So I appreciate everything that you're doing. Now, I think that comes down to education, and that's not a quick fix, I would say. It's a long road to get there. I think internally and in the big companies, etc. For example, I think what we call resource group, for example, have a big role to play, in terms of making sure that the leadership of these big companies are educated, people like me as well, sponsoring everything around diversity, equity, and inclusion, working on the DEI strategies. And I would say probably my advice for the big companies here is to try to partner with actors like yours, and make sure that they put that at the forefront as well, and that they're intentional about DEI and about including it in their strategy.
Yeah.
Because the way it works, and I've seen it myself as well, when you're trying to recruit people, the easy way is you go back to what you know you can do very quickly.
Yeah.
I think
you go back to the same school. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Idriss.
No, you go back to the same school. You go back to the same people. You ask your employees to refer people. But actually, they're referring people like them. So it's a lot about how do we change that, how we change the mindset, how do we make sure that in every single process that you design, you have this DEI piece to make sure that you don't default to going back to the majority, going back to the normal/conventional, as you were asking, and making sure as well that these companies understand the value of it. So when you do recruit more diverse profiles, and it's been proven in a lot of different studies across the globe, having diversity within your team is actually a benefit for your company in terms of profit. Companies are more profitable. In terms of productivity, companies are more productive. So it's a big question, to be honest. I try to sum it up as well as I can, but yeah, it's just about making sure that everyone is intentional and that we design the right processes to try to limit the defaulting to the normal bias that we have, and
I've seen work in action, Ronan, personal experience, and I think intentional, right? That is the word. It's about, we can say words like quotas, but I think it's really important. You've got to have your data, you've got to know the facts, and you've got to challenge and push. You've got to say, why do we not have more diversity? And it's such a broad term. It's not just gender, it's also ethnic background, language, skills, all of that, socioeconomic status. There's so much to it, and I think hiring managers have a direct impact in saying, I want diverse candidates, I want to see diversity. I've seen that change in 12 months in my own team. It's remarkable when someone says, I want this, let's do it. It can be super difficult, but it can also be possible with just that intention of saying, we've got too many of this, white Irish, whatever it is too many of in your organization is, we need different. And you ask for it and you push for it. Claudia, have you any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had personal experience of this. I've had experience of senior leadership really wanting me on the team, really believing in me, and believing in the impact that I can bring. And then middle management wanting to cross-check everything I produce just in case it's not good enough. And so I think it really comes down to changing how we even look at D&I. I think DE&I for a long time has focused on the D. Okay, we focused on diversity. Well, guess what? We have diversity. Just look around this room. Got that nailed. We now need to move on. And I think it's moving the conversation along. You know, how do we embed practices so that it's second nature, even to hiring managers? How are we making sure that our spaces are not just equitable, but they're really, really inclusive, and not the tick box exercise, not the buzzword meaning of equity and inclusion? Are these people that we've hired, do they have the same access to opportunities, to promotion, to anything else? Do they have the same access as everybody else? Are we retaining them at the same level? And if we're not, are we making our processes equitable, not equal? So a really simple example, there was a case study on the warehousing industry in Ireland. Really interesting that, a number of people working in warehousing were from all different parts of the world. But the holiday entitlements were the same for everybody. Okay, so equal, same for everybody across the board, right? But if home for you is Cork, and it takes you a couple of hours to get there, grand, because if the holiday entitlement is nobody can take any more than 2 weeks at one time, okay? But if home for you is Nigeria, and it takes you a number of hours or days to get there, and and the cost of it, the time it takes to get there, then you want to stay there. Well then, how is the 2-week rule across the board for everybody effective? How are you making sure that those people feel just as welcome, just as happy? How are you retaining all of that talent? So we need to move on from diversity, we need to move on from equality, and we really need to think about what it means to be inclusive.
Yeah.
And I think that's tying back perfectly to your point, Idriss. Yeah. You talked about the meaningful resource groups and how those resource groups can really influence retention.
Absolutely.
So it ties that perfectly together.
Yeah, and maybe just while you were talking, something came to my mind, and just wanted to add 2 points. The first one, and I was talking about processes, you were talking about hiring, and here there's some quick fixes that you can also implement. Typically, one of the things that I've implemented within my team at Meta is that we want to have, it's called DSA, a diverse slate approach. So every time that we have a role that is opening, before we move to interview loop on site or virtual, we need to have a fair representation, 50% female, 50% male.
Amazing.
So that's something that we do, and the loop doesn't start if we don't have this representation. And actually, a fun fact, in my team, there's a high representation of women. I think it's probably 75-80% of women in the team. And 2 days ago, I was asked by someone, are you recruiting only girls? And my answer is well, first, I couldn't believe to be asked this question. Second, my answer was absolutely not, actually. But what we do is that we build a pipeline that is 50-50, and we give the same opportunities to female and male to join the team. And the fact is that the person that have been the best during the interviews, the interview process have been all the female that are in the team. When a male is better, well, he's in the team. But sorry for all the male in the room, it happens to be that they're but at least in my experience, in this time period where I was recruiting, that they were not the best performers. But if you don't give access, if you don't give the opportunity, the same opportunity, if you have like 4 male for one female, obviously, the game is rigged from the get-going. So that would be one thing. And the second thing I want to talk about is just, and you mentioned it, on diversity. I think, yes, we have diversity, but we also need to change the way we look at diversity, potentially. Especially in our context, in Europe, there's a lot of restrictions when we think about diversity. I think it's only gender, mostly, that can be tracked as a number. So that's where we need to rely a lot on intentionality, as I was talking about, to go even beyond gender, and to make sure that when we talk about diversity, it's gender, absolutely, and we need to keep pushing on this agenda, and we need to keep going. And there's also other diversity. And there's also intersectionality, and I think that's a term as well that is not used as often as it should be. We should definitely look at intersectionality when we look at recruiting, hiring, and to go back to your question. Okay.
Super. So I'm going to wrap it up, yes. So that's where we're going to... I would like a special thank you to Claudia and Idriss, both of whom are struggling with illness. Idriss has joined us from his sick bed. He shouldn't be here. And as you can see, Claudia has had to wear runners because she's in so much pain with her back. So I wanted to give them a huge round of applause for their inspirational talk tonight and for being here. Thank you so much.